In this lecture, we're going to talk about the last portion of Spanish rule over Texas and how Spanish Texas becomes Mexican Texas. I feel like in U.S. history courses and in Texas history courses, we don't often talk enough about how much the U.S. alliance with Spain actually aided the United States during the Revolution, the American Revolution, but it did aid the U.S. a great deal. Of course, in terms of New Spain, the main contribution of Texas was to provide longhorn cattle to U.S. forces in the east, cattle that could be slaughtered and eaten by U.S. forces in the east. But you also have to remember contributions of men like General Bernardo de Galvez, who was the commander of Spanish forces in New Orleans. He, of course, led Spanish forces out, defeated the British in several small battles along the Mississippi, and so kept the British from taking the Louisiana Territory. Galveston, Texas is named for General Galvez. During this time, Spanish authorities began granting leagues of land to aid in ranching. Of course, a league of land is 4,428 acres. But Texas in general remained a poor backwater of New Spain. Meanwhile, Comanches and Apaches continued to raid Spanish settlements in Texas. Finally, in 1785, the Spanish signed a peace treaty with the Comanches that ended hostilities with them for the next 40 years. The Apaches remained enemies of both sides. But this is the state of Texas in the late 18th century. During this time period, Spain became increasingly worried about the expanding United States, and they reacted harshly to intruders from the United States. Philip Nolan, who is a native of Ireland, came to New Orleans in the late 1780s. Nolan heard of trading opportunities in Texas and applied for a passport from the Spanish governor of Louisiana in 1791, but suspecting him of illegal activity, the Spanish seized his goods and expelled him from the province. In the winter of 1794 and 95, Nolan made another trip to Texas with another passport, and again in 97, bringing back mustangs with him each time to sell in New Orleans. By 1799, the Spanish, though, had again become suspicious of Nolan's intentions and ordered that he not be allowed return to Texas. Nolan ignored the orders and crossed back into Texas in October of 1800. He and his men spent the winter in central Texas gathering mustangs, but on the morning of March 22, 1801, Nolan and his men awoke to find their camp surrounded by Spanish soldiers from Nacogdoches. The Spanish soldiers, of course, then shot and killed Nolan and his men. Nolan's expedition worried the Spanish even further about intruders from the United States into their territory. Now, in international developments, in 1795, the Spanish approached the French about trading them Louisiana to save them the cost of administering the Louisiana Territory and to use France as a buffer between New Spain and the United States. On October 1st, 1800, the Spanish signed the Retrocession of San Ildefonso, which turned Louisiana back over to France. In this treaty, Napoleon promised never to turn the Louisiana Territory over to another country. And the reason that Napoleon wanted the Louisiana Territory is at that time he was dealing with a rebellion of enslaved Africans in the French sugar colony of Saint-Domingue, later Haiti. And he needed a base of operations to move against them, and that base of operations, of course, was New Orleans. And so that's why Napoleon wanted Louisiana back. But as things got worse in Haiti, it was clear the French would lose Haiti. In 1803, Napoleon changed his mind and sold the Louisiana Territory to the United States, which of course made neighbors between the U.S. and New Spain. Nemesio Salcedo, the commandant of the interior provinces of New Spain, arranged for a neutral ground agreement in 1806 with the United States. Under this agreement, neither power would have any authority over a strip of land between the Sabine and the Calcasieu and Arroyo Hondo rivers in what is now Louisiana. And you can see a map of the neutral ground there highlighted in pink in the map on the right. On the west is the Sabine River. On the east is the Calcasieu and Arroyo Hondo rivers. Even as Napoleon tried to conquer Europe in 1808, the French invaded Spain. The Spanish rebelled against French rule in a fierce guerrilla warfare. In fact, this is where guerrilla warfare gets its name. Guerre, war, ia, little. So this is a Spanish word, guerrilla warfare against the French. And it becomes so bloody that it becomes known as Napoleon's Spanish ulcer. Because of the French rule over Spain, in New Spain, in the colony, a rift developed between Peninsulares, that's the natives of New Spain, or natives of Spain who held most of the power, and the Criollos, who were the natives of New Spain, over which form of colonial government should prevail in light of events in the mother country. On September 16, 1810, Días y Seis, Father Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla, a Criollo, gave a speech called the Grito de Dolores, or Cry of Pain, calling for governmental reform. But the reform movement turned into a war between the Criollos and the Peninsulares, a war for separation from Spain. Hidalgo was executed, but the fight for independence continued on for another 11 years. And of course, this fight for independence would ultimately result in the formation of the Republic of Mexico in 1821. But the war in New Spain guaranteed confusion in Texas, especially as Americans eyed Texas with a view toward trying to take the territory from the Spanish. This begins the era of filibustering, or filibusterers. And a filibuster is a land pirate. That's the image of a filibusterer. That's why these are called filibustering expeditions. One of Hidalgo's followers who escaped execution was Bernardo Gutierrez de Lara, who traveled to the United States, met with President James Monroe. Publicly, Monroe was reluctant to offer aid to Gutierrez in his bid to invade and retake Texas, but privately, Monroe did actually put the resources of the United States behind this expedition. Gutierrez traveled to New Orleans and then to Natchitoches, Louisiana, where he began assembling an army to invade Texas with the help of Augustus William McGee, a West Point graduate who took command of the American contingent of what became known as the Republican Army of the North. They were also known as the Green Flag Expedition because of their green flag you can see there on your screen. Gutierrez and McGee crossed the Sabine River in August 1812 and took Nacogdoches without a fight. With about 300 men, they also captured Presidio La Bahia without a fight. Governor Salcedo and Colonel Simón de Herrera laid siege to the invading army at La Bahia until February 9, 1813, and at that point the Royalists retreated to San Antonio, and the invading army, minus McGee, who was killed, followed them. On March 28, Gutierrez and his army defeated Salcedo and Herrera at the junction of Salado Creek and the San Antonio River at the Battle of Salado. And on April 1st, 1813, Gutierrez and Samuel Kemper, who had replaced McGee, entered San Antonio and proclaimed Texas independent. So, Gutierrez and Kemper have declared Texas independent. Meanwhile, Gutierrez had Salcedo and Herrera tried for treason. They were convicted, but he promised to imprison them somewhere outside of San Antonio. Instead, Gutierrez took them outside of San Antonio and had them shot. And at that point, in protest, 100 Americans, including Kemper, returned to Louisiana. The remaining Anglo invaders threatened to leave unless Gutierrez resigned. With no choice, Gutierrez left Texas. Meanwhile, this is also when President James Monroe pulled the support of the United States, was after the murder of Salcedo and Herrera. Jose Alvarez de Toledo took command of what remained of the Republican Army of the North, and a Spanish army under General Joaquin de Arredondo approached San Antonio. Arredondo's 2,000 soldiers met Toledo's 1,400 at the Battle of Medina River on August 18, 1813. This is the biggest battle ever fought in Texas. Arredondo's men killed most of Toledo's force on the field, and they executed 327 prisoners. They also executed several men who were sympathetic to Toledo in San Antonio and Nacogdoches. And this is the beginning of Spanish reactions toward filibustering expeditions in which they execute all of the prisoners. Arredondo declared no mercy, no quarter, because these men were not soldiers. In his estimation, they were filibusterers, pirates. And one of the young Spanish soldiers that served on Arredondo's staff was 16-year-old Lieutenant Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. Santa Anna had lied about his age to enlist in the Spanish army, and this was Santa Anna's first encounter with filibusters from Los Estados Unidos, filibusters from the United States, and of course he learned his lesson under General Arredondo well. This explains many of Santa Anna's actions during the later Texas Revolution. The next filibustering expedition was that of Henry Perry. In the summer of 1816, Luis Ari occupied Galveston Island and began gathering forces for a filibustering invasion of Texas. He was joined there by Henry Perry, a veteran of the Gutierrez-McGee expedition who had escaped at the Battle of Medina River. In November 1816, Francisca Mina also joined Ari and Perry. Together, the three landed on the coast of Tamaulipas in April of 1817. Perry then split off from the main column and marched north toward Presidio La Bahia. Perry reached La Bahia in June, but was surrounded by a loyalist army, and surrounded by Spanish troops, again under General Joaquin de Arredondo, Perry committed suicide, and Arredondo put down this filibustering expedition as well. Meanwhile, on the international scene, in 1815, Andrew Jackson marched into Spanish Florida pursuing the Seminoles, and this sparked an international crisis. Now the Spanish are concerned about having their territory taken in Texas and in Florida by the United States. So in 1819, Louis Onis and John Adams signed the Adams-Onis Treaty, and in this treaty, the United States acquired Florida for $2 million in exchange for renouncing all claims on Texas that might have arisen out of the Louisiana Purchase. If you recall, at the time of the Louisiana Purchase, even President Thomas Jefferson believed that Texas was a part of the Louisiana Purchase. But this Adams-Onis Treaty with the red line you can see drawn on the map there on your screen settled these boundary disputes once and for all, establishing the Sabine River and the Red River as the northern and eastern boundaries of New Spain, where Texas was concerned. Even after the Adams-Onis Treaty, the Spanish still had to fend off another filibustering expedition from the United States, the Long Expedition. In the summer of 1819, James Long, who was a merchant from Natchez, Mississippi, decided to do something about what he called the unwarranted surrender of Texas. Long felt that Texas was a part of the Louisiana Purchase. He got the support of local merchants and Bernardo Gutierrez, leader of the 1812 and 1813 expedition, and Long raised an army of 300 men, crossed the Sabine River, and took control of Nacogdoches. This is the flag of the expedition you can see there on your screen. Long traveled to Galveston Island to try to get the help from the Lafitte brothers there, but he failed. And in the meantime, Spanish troops drove his filibustering expedition out of Texas. Long escaped to New Orleans and raised another army of 50 men, sailed for Galveston Island, and then in September of 1821, he and his men sailed down the coast to attack Presidio La Bahia. But they were captured by troops sent from San Antonio. Long was taken to Mexico City, where in all probability a guard murdered him in his cell on orders from Spanish authorities. But this was the last filibustering expedition. The Spanish signed over Mexican independence, seeing that it was hopeless to resist, in the Treaty of Cordoba on August 24, 1821. And at that point, Spanish Texas became Mexican Texas. Let's examine the legacy of Spain on Texas. The Spanish lent names to many Texas regions, towns, counties. Cattle ranching also produced many techniques that are still used, like herding from horseback, roping, branding, and the roundup. The Spanish also introduced mesquite. At first, mesquite only grew along river bottoms, but carried in the dung of Spanish animals, it spread across Texas. Spanish heritage also added to later Texas law, including giving women property rights, unlike English common law at the time, and that carried over into Texas law. Spanish law also created 19th century Texas homestead laws, which gave Texans strong debt protection for their principal residences. And to this day, Texas homestead laws uh, protect many Texans and their principal residences. Texas water law also sprang out of Spanish water law. The Spanish held all streams and rivers in common, which was a practice that still holds in Texas. Eventually it would be adopted by all of the United States, but it's a tradition that came out of Spanish law to hold all rivers and streams in common. So these are just a few ways that Spain left an indelible legacy on Texas.